I'm just going to present a few of my thoughts on a couple of recent videos, and it's a very difficult subject, whether or not suicide is ever justified. I mean, that seems to be the crux of what both videos are about. On the face of it, it's an obviously absurd question because it's impossible to understand what happens to drive another person to make that choice. So I'm not going to try to talk in detail about that because I really don't know. Instead, I'm going to talk about a specific case. Last year, one of my favorite writers, David Foster Wallace, made the choice to take his own life. He was an amazing person. His best-known novel is Infinite Jest. And he was almost universally acknowledged as one of the deepest, most talented writers of his generation. Now, there are obvious reasons for his decision. If it can be called, I don't know if it can be called a decision, really, when you commit suicide. But anyway, he'd suffered from severe depression for more than half of his life, and he'd been taking an antidepressant which allowed him to be productive. But he'd gotten off of it, and when he tried to return, he couldn't really function when he wasn't taking the medication. But when he tried to return to taking it, it no longer worked, and in addition, there were bad side effects. So, he was left with very bad choices. But looking at it that way, I think those are somehow obvious and superficial reasons. I think the reasons were also deeper than that. And also, as I've said earlier, impossible for any of us to fully understand, as it is in any act of suicide. The interesting thing is, though, that David Foster Wallace left a lot of writing behind. And it's a lot of writing that I've enjoyed reading. And I've looked at it again to try to make what I consider an incomprehensible act comprehensible. I've decided that's not really possible. But it's possible to think about it and in that way come to some sort of tentative, fragmented understanding. The reason I think that's important is that David found it impossible to live as most of us do. I mean, most of us live pretty superficial lives, and we don't think very much about what's beneath the surface of life or even our motivations in what we do. But he wanted to understand complex things. He wanted to understand, for example, what it means to act in a meaningful way in a world that is determined, and where there's an obvious absence of truly free action. One of his majors at Amherst College, where he was an undergraduate, was philosophy. And he did his graduate thesis on, it sounds really, really dry and obscure, but it's really pretty interesting. It's a kind of modal logic. And in it, just forget about the modal logic and think about what he was writing about. He addressed what he considered fatal fallacies, if you can use that, or fallacies, in the philosophical position of a philosopher called Richard Taylor, who is a philosophical fatalist. Fatalists contend quite radically that human actions and decisions have no influence on the future. Your behavior today no more shapes events tomorrow than it shapes events yesterday. Instead, in a seemingly backward way, the fatalist says, it is how things are in the future that uniquely constrain what happens right now. What might seem like an open possibility subject to human choice is already either impossible or absolutely necessary. He shows, that is, David Wallace Foster showed really conclusive, I consider it conclusive, flaws in Taylor's logic. And I'm not going to go into it here. There's a brief summary of it in the sidebar that you can take a look at, which appeared in the New York Times. But he was, the reason I'm presenting this kind of dry example of what he did besides his fiction is because I think it's important to see what he considered important and what he left behind. Because he truly tried to make sense of the world, and I don't think there would be any contention that he wasn't a force for good in the world. He was complex and caring, and the fact that he came to his own conclusions about what to do with his own life seems both important and sad to me. And I really don't have the right to say that he was wrong in his decision, but of course personally, I wish he'd chosen differently, just because I selfishly thought he was doing things I found so interesting that I just feel bereft, which isn't a word I don't like to use, but I have felt bereft during the last year because of his absence. And I think that the world is a sadder, more impoverished place without him. And I didn't even know him, but I knew him through his work. And because he left behind a body of work that is true genius, in my opinion, he led a meaningful life. A much more meaningful life than most of us will ever accomplish. By coincidence, or he left behind a novel. It's unfinished. The working title is called The Pale King. It's going to be published next year. There is a quote that he left behind about his intention towards his audience in that novel. And he said he wanted to encourage his audience to be conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. That to me seems like the most important thing that really any of us can do. And the only thing we can ever try to do as individuals is make some positive difference for the future. Not just for human beings, but for living things, basically. Anyway, thanks a lot, and those are my rather fragmented thoughts on suicide. You guys take care of yourselves. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.